people asking the same question. Is it's about how do we, with the social justice issues and discussions going on today, um, how do we better teach cultural relevance about things like Native Americans, Indians in Texas, and things like that? So I wanted to know, in your class, maybe you can think about it this way, like in your classes, because you teach here at UNT on Native American history on a regular basis, how do you deal with that, and what works well for you in your classroom in trying to make that something that is addressed and handled in the classroom?
I guess sort of what I go into again is that the Anglo-American Protestants, they really do not recognize the Indian rights to the land, and tend to, in the historiography, the tales told by the settlers, the main Indian antagonists are the Comanches, who are sort of easy to demonize as they are not agricultural. They are horseback, equestrian, nomadic buffalo hunters who also make their living by raiding and kidnapping and things like that. So in the past, they would make it this civilization versus savage kind of thing. Therefore, the Americans had the right to conquer Texas and remove these uncivilized Indians. But in this case, since the Indians are just as civilized, one could argue, as the Americans, it becomes obvious that basically the Americans are not open to sharing the land with the Native Americans. And since the Native Americans in the Southeast have the best land, the Americans want that so they can raise cotton through their slaves. One of the comments I tend to make at the start of class is that the Indians all died during disease, so the Europeans imported slaves, and then they took over North America, and that's it. We don't have to have the class anymore. So that's the big overview. So I guess the idea is that the racism of the Anglos is clear towards Native Americans right off the bat. And another thing I'd like to point out is that Texas is just an extension of that westward migration of the Anglo-Protestants that is consuming the Trans-Appalachian area after 1815.
Yeah. But let me ask you this then, to follow up, like something I struggle with in my classrooms, right? Like there are so few records that I can bring into my classroom that give the perspective of Native groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I've got letters from Austin, I've got letters from Lamar, I've got letters from Houston, and I can read the words of these people or have my students do that. But I don't know if there's a way, since this is something that you deal with much more directly, that you try to bring in that perspective in a more first-person kind of way.
Yeah, it's difficult because they don't have those letters and things like that. However, since the Cherokees could read and write, all of those people you just mentioned are addressing letters to them, asking them. So we can get, Austin, one of the documents I have, Austin encourages the Cherokees to go against the Wacos and Tawakanis. So, and Mieri Teran met with them and recorded what they said and things like that. Mm-hmm. So you can take it from there. There are a few documents like that, but obviously these Indians want to just come to a land. They can say, okay, here we are. We can raise our crops, our animals, just like you, and be free from attack or encroachment or things like that. That's sort of the Native American perspective of all the Indians of Texas who are agricultural during this period. Yeah. Just give us our land, don't bother us, and we'll be happy. And we'll get along with you for the most part.
We'll get along with you. And that brings up a question that's been asked a couple different ways in the question group, which is, one of the questions is, what do you think about people denouncing the Texas Rangers and all that? Now, the Texas Rangers didn't really exist as the Texas Rangers during this period, although Austin's militia is often sometimes pointed to as like an early Ranger sort of inclination. But there's another question too that dovetails on that, and I think it's what the first question is getting at, which is how Austin dealt with the Karankawas, right, and his campaign against them. So I wondered if you could talk really briefly about Austin and his colonists, in this case, not getting along,
right,
specifically with the Karankawas and this was often called a kind of early version of the Rangers and what that history looked like.
Right. With Austin, it's almost right off the bat, since he comes in 1822, I think, and says that the Karankawas are cannibals and need to be exterminated and that kind of thing. So with Austin, his colony is sort of different. The Eastern immigrant Indians, they're there, and there's hardly anybody there yet. So the Anglos are newcomers to it, and they all sort of get along to some extent. Whereas the Karankawas are seen right off the bat as a threat to Austin. They control the mouths of the river. They are, quote unquote, uncivilized. They are not agricultural. They live in that sort of lagoon area, and they are seen as bad right off the bat. We got to get rid of them. And so Austin then sides with the Tonkawas, who live a little bit farther inland. And the Tonkawas have already, in the late 18 teens, sided with the Spaniards as auxiliaries against the Comanches and Wichitas and things like that. So Austin picks up on that. And along with his militia group, who you want to call them the Rangers or not, did attack them and exterminated them. And I think that's, one can say, one could use the genocide word on the Karankawas, because by 1823, 1824, it was a shoot on sight against the Karankawas.
Right. I mean, Austin literally says, "I'm going to exterminate them."
Right. And this is at the same time he's, befriending the Cherokees and writing letters to Chief Bowles saying, if you attack the Wichitas, well, you shouldn't join the Fredonian Rebellion. And then if you attack the Wacos, we'll back you on your land grants and stuff like that.
Right, which I think for like a lot of students gets confusing in the sense that they know there's different tribes and different groups, but they often have, there's so many sometimes for them, have a hard time understanding the different geographic situational positions of them. And the Anglos tend to, they appreciate the difference between the Comanches and the Cherokees, but as a general rule, have a sort of broad sort of negative sense usually of Native American groups, right? Like Sam Houston's an outlier, and Houston Lamar is more the norm when it comes to attitudes amongst Anglo-Americans toward Native groups.
Although I think that both of them would probably share the idea that Anglo-American Christians are superior to the Indians. Sam Houston just has the idea that we, sort of the idea that if we put them on a reservation, we can live with them and eventually they will become Americanized, which was the original founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. That was their idea, that we can Americanize the Indians. Whereas Lamar and the others are like, let's move them all to Oklahoma or just kill them or whatever.
Right. Well, by that point, things had changed. That's the thing about it. Like, there's not just one idea that persists over this entire period. These evolve over time, and the situation as it shifts. As you pointed out at the beginning, the Anglo-Americans are so few of them that it's hard for them to, they don't have a critical mass. But once they do in the 1830s, it's a very different situation for the Indians who moved to the United States into Mexico in East Texas.
Right. I think, again, just starting in 1607 or whatever we want to start, the English settlers, basically deep in their heart, they want the land and do not really want to deal with Indians if they can get away with it. Whereas the Spaniards, they are coming and there's not very many of them, and they want to Hispanicize the Indians, and therefore the Indians are settler. We'll bring them Christianity, we'll bring them all this European stuff, and they will be the citizens of Spanish Mexico. That's never an idea that the Anglos have.
Yeah. So a question a lot of people are asking in different ways is what is the preferred term or terms to use when in the classroom for Native groups? And my question, to sharpen that a little bit, is what do Native groups themselves tend to prefer, if you have any sort of sense of that? Because in my classroom, I use Native Americans, I use American Indians, I use Indians sometimes, interchangeably as sort of a broad definition besides tribal names. But I don't know if you have a sense of both what the norm is in scholarship, but also what Native groups themselves tend to have.
I think in scholarship and in writing, probably Native Americans is the preferred form. But as we're in the classroom, Native Americans, American Indians, that kind of thing. I think more would be the idea of stressing the tribal nature, since all American Indians are, they're all different. They might have been the enemy of the Anglo-American Protestants, but they all are so different, as we see here that the Cherokees are fighting against the Wacos. The Cherokees also, I didn't go into, have sort of fought against the Caddos and made them sort of irrelevant when it comes to Northeastern affairs. So they all have their all different agendas and things like that. So I think each tribe has to be taken on its own.
Yeah. Well, that gets to some questions that people are asking about the different groups within Texas. One that popped up earlier that I personally would like to know more about is, why were the Tawakonis and the Wacos so negatively viewed by so many groups, and so focused on for harsh attack, it seems like to me.
I think that might be because in the 1820s, they are the most formidable group in Texas. I mean, obviously the Comanches are, but they're so far to the west. But the Comanches and the Wacos are, and the Tawakonis are allied with one another. They've been allies for 70 years and things like that. And therefore, the Comanche raids that do take place tend to take place in conjunction with the Wacos and Tawakonis. But the Comanches are so fierce and so far to the west that they are basically unattainable until almost 1840 to attack. Whereas the Wichita groups, since they live in sedentary villages, you just go to their town, and like what the Mexican troops will do in 1831, they'll go to the Waco village at Waco. The Wacos abandon it, and the Mexicans just burn it to the ground, and that's that. That town's destroyed, and they all have to move sort of up to Oklahoma.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, I mean, one person asked a question about kind of geography and the West versus the East within Texas, and how that played, within these different groups. I thought you did a beautiful job of talking about, the Comanches and the Apaches, but particularly the Comanches are out in the sort of far western zone. Right. And in East Texas, it's sort of this undefined region when a lot of these groups show up, but then the Anglos sort of overwhelm them. But could you talk a little bit about how that geography mattered in both relationships between these groups and their survival? Because it's by the end of by the 1840s, basically East Texas has been wiped out in terms of Indian presence, and the Comanches persist until 1875.
Right. Well, I think a good way to think about it, and I forgot to put this in there, is that if you forget about the state borders and the state boundaries and all that kind of stuff, and just think about that the eastern woodlands, which basically is the geographic configuration of everything from the Atlantic coast to, let's say, I-35, that is the eastern woodlands. That's pretty much, a well-watered, forested area. And in the Southeast, the most successful advanced tribes, the Mississippian groups, use that area to farm so successfully, and that stretches into Texas. It's just a diplomatic feature that in 1819, Spain and the United States decided to make the border at Louisiana and Texas, as opposed to really geographically or environmentally, the border should be, I-35. So the Comanches are in the Southwest, whereas East Texas is really a part of the Southeast. And the same things that happen in the Southeast of the United States, such as the Indian Removal Act and all that, the same thing is happening in Texas, but with more force, I guess, since the Texans are not under the control of the United States.
What would you say, how would you, if you're in the classroom, it's something I think about a lot, it's a question asked about, how do you weigh, when you're telling this history, because there's so many things to tell, there's so many perspectives to bring in, the influence of the tribes in East Texas versus the influence of, again, the Comanche is the sort of biggest, most powerful group out in the West. Like, how do you weigh that in the classroom in a way that kind of gives a sense to students, like, this is where you need to focus. They're all important, but this is what had more influence in how things turned out, and how we weigh that.
I guess in my class, I would have been starting at the beginning, and therefore pointing out that the Comanches are also immigrants to Texas, didn't really get here till 1700 and really probably weren't a force until 1730. But, and only through trade with the Caddos and Wichitas, they obtain items from the French in Louisiana. And that once again, once they got powerful, they established their own state of Comancheria that the Spaniards of New Mexico and the Spaniards of Texas pretty much recognized as, okay, this is Comanche territory where we barely even get through it. And it's just a whole different ball game than it's like dealing with the Sioux in South Dakota versus the Iowas in Iowa, you know, one's a farming group, one's a horseback group, and there's really two different kinds of Indians. I guess that's how I
That's
deal
good.
with it.
I think that's all the time we have for questions right now.